from back in jQuery, we do something like, select some element. I'll select my form, and then I will have a callback when that's submitted. So I'd say something like, find my form, dot on submit, and then I'd have a function which will run there. Well, in React, it's actually even a little bit simpler than that, because we've got direct access to the DOM elements in our render method. So what you can do is you can just directly attach callbacks to the DOM elements and then do whatever you like within those callbacks. So you can see an example of that here. We've got an onSubmit method in our form. And basically, we set that to an arrow function. It's kind of best to always just use arrow functions for these, at least as you're starting to learn. There's a few different ways that you can write these, and you'll see different things when you're looking at code. But arrow functions are a nice, simple starting point. You don't have to worry about the binding of this if you use arrow functions. In this code, we can basically do anything we like. So here I've got an arrow function which is called when I submit my form. Takes an event as an argument, just the same as in jQuery. And as a simple first step, I could just console log hello. And when I submit my form, if I have a look at my console, I need to print default to so it doesn't refresh. If I do that and submit my form, you can see that it console logs hello. Now, in terms of what I actually do in this example, basically what I'm doing is I'm calling out to a method which we've created. So this add item method is basically the thing which does what we want to do. And the thing which we want to do is basically add to our state. Because this is our kind of source of truth. This is our list of things. So what we want to do is add something in.
Hi, Doctor.
So we'll take a look at that in 2 secs. But I'll just pause there. Does everyone understand that kind of first bit, how we make something interactive happen? So this could be on submit, could be on click, on mouse over, on whatever. Give me a thumbs up if that makes sense. Shout me a question if you got one. All right, awesome. So let's look at this next part. What we want to do is we want to update our state and make it so that something new is added to the end of our list of items. And the way we go about that is we use this function called this.setState. This is basically a method which React provides us. And it's the method you use for doing all of your state updates in React. Basically what it does is the keys, it kind of takes the keys and replaces whatever that key is with the value. So what we're doing here is we're using the spread operator to take our kind of existing list of items and make a new array based on that with something new added to the end. So as a kind of early version, I could just use a string here, something like foo, for example. And then every time I submit my form, it would add foo to the end of my list. You'll notice that I don't just say something like this.state.push foo. This rule in React that you shouldn't directly modify the state object. We're going to talk about that lots more on Thursday, so I don't want to kind of overlabor that point because we're going to look at the reasons behind it then. But basically what that means is that you're always going to want to use this.setState when you're updating your state rather than, this.state.whatever equals that, or, anything where you're directly modifying this.state. You should always be using this.setState. And when we call that this.setState, this is where the kind of nice bit of React comes in. So we've added this value foo to the end of it, and you'll notice that we haven't had to like do anything clever to make it re-render. We haven't had to explicitly say, okay, your state's updated, so you need to re-render. React kind of does that automatically for us. So anytime a component state updates or its props update, you automatically get this re-rendering process taking place. And this is kind of one of the great joys of React, is that you, as a developer, just have to worry about making sure that the information's right, so the correct information is in the state, the correct information is in the props. And all of that re-rendering and redrawing is taken care of for you. You just don't have to think about it at all, and it will do that in a super, super efficient way. It's basically the best thing about React, and the reason why it's caught on so much is that that you have to think about a lot less as a developer. So that's the next part. You will see how we've updated the state to set those items. Give me a thumbs up if that makes sense. Shout me a question if you got one. All right, awesome. So the next thing that we need to look at is basically how we actually grab the value from this items to add box, rather than just adding a string each time foo. How I get that I should go for a walk. So I'll just undo that change I made. And there's kind of two different ways to go about this. They're called controlled and uncontrolled inputs. So the first way we're going to look at is the uncontrolled way. And with an uncontrolled input, basically it's pretty similar to what you did in jQuery. You get direct access to the DOM element, and then you just grab the value from it. And the way that's done is it's done with these things called refs. This syntax is changing a little bit, actually. Well, this syntax is staying, but there's a simpler syntax coming through in the next version of React. So keep an eye out for that. But for the moment, we'll stick with this. Basically, what a ref does is it allows you to get direct access to the DOM element. So what happens here is when the component's rendered, this callback gets called. So again, we're using an arrow function here. When this is called, basically the DOM element itself gets passed in. So if I did something like, console.log element here, you'll see that when my component gets rendered, that element is basically the input itself. It's this DOM element which I'm working with. And what I can do is basically I store that so I can use it later. So by saying this.input is equal to this element, basically I'm storing it as part of my app object, as part of my component. So then at a later date, I can, get direct access to that input so I can grab the value. And I do that here. Basically, I say, okay, let's grab that input which I stored last time I rendered, and let's grab the value of that input. And obviously, that's going to be whatever I've typed in here. And so when I add the item, then you can see that that actual thing gets added in rather than anything else. So that's that kind of uncontrolled way of doing things. This input's just treated like any old DOM input, and the ref allows us to get access to it. It's kind of the simplest way to work with grabbing inputs. Although we'll see kind of as we go on that there's kind of some things where you need something slightly more complicated for that. And we'll look at that pattern in a sec, the controlled inputs rather than uncontrolled. But I'll pause there. Does everyone see how we've managed to use this ref to grab that input value? Could be a thumbs up if that makes sense. shout me a question if you got one. Awesome. Yeah, it is. It's really nice, Bianca. You'll see as we start to like build out to bigger applications, then these patterns become like really, really clean working through. So, yeah. Okay. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just switch branch. I've got a branch which shows this kind of as a controlled input. So I will pick out my controlled version of this. Again, so it reloads. You'll see that this works in the same way as it did before. Now, the difference between the uncontrolled version and the controlled version is that when you've got a controlled input, the actual value of the input is stored as a separate part of your state. So you can see here, rather than just having one thing in our state, our list of items, we've got our list of items, plus we've got the value that we typed into that input. If I have a look in the dev tools, you can see that basically we kind of live update that. So as I'm typing here, then that gets live updated. And then when I come to actually add the item, then we can grab whatever the kind of most recent thing that was typed in from the state. And use that as the value that we add to the list. This is the kind of fundamental idea behind controlled inputs, that the value of the input is part of your state, and then you can do whatever you like with it. The way that works in practice is actually kind of relatively straightforward. It goes back to this idea that we can add on whatever events to DOM elements. And so what you do is you do that directly to the input which you want to capture. You add an on-change event listener, which basically listens for any changes to this. So that could be copying and pasting. Will make a change. That could be deleting things. That could be adding things. When any of those things happen, what do? We update the state. So remember, using this.setState, we update the value part of the state. So the place where we're storing whatever we type in here, kind of live. And because we've got the event from that input itself, we can use e.target.value to grab the actual thing that we've typed in here. Again, just the same as you were doing back with jQuery or vanilla JavaScript. And that stores that information in the state. So whatever's typed in here is always exactly reflected in the state. The two will kind of be synced up with this on change. And then obviously when I submit my form, then I can grab that value and add it to my list. So there's maybe actually a little bit less to learn with controlled inputs. They sort of follow the same patterns as all of the interactivity, albeit there's a little bit more code that you have to write if you want to use a controlled input. So you have to add to the state and add this extra on change. So that's kind of the two different ways to do that, to grab the values from inputs, and use them at some later date. Does that part make sense? Do you see how we've switched from an uncontrolled to a controlled input and are now keeping that value in the state? Yeah, give me a thumbs up or shout me a question if you got one. Okay, cool. So the last version of this I'm going to look at basically goes one stage further. So you can see that at the moment our component's sort of doing a couple of things at once. We've got this list of stuff displaying, which might be useful on its own as a component. And we've got this form for adding things, which again might be useful on its own as a component. We might want to reuse either part of this. So it makes me think that we could start to, split this component apart into two separate components. But that adds some extra difficulties because what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to kind of communicate between those different levels of the components. So I will check out my last version. We'll take a look at that. So what we've got here is basically we've got a version of the app, but now rather than just one component, it's split into three separate components. Sorry, I'm just going to have a little cough. Let me turn off my mic. Thank you for bearing with me. So yeah, we've got this version where now rather than just a single component, we've got separate components for each of our parts. So if I have a look at my kind of hierarchy, we've got this app component, which renders my to-do list component, and it also renders my add form component. So the to-do list is rendering the list up here, the add form's rendering the items down here. And we sort of have direct communication in two directions here. So our state still lives at our top level app component, which allows it to, be updated by this and to pass the information down to this. So to get the information coming down from my app component to my to-do list, basically, so this can actually display the list of items, is what you already know. To get information from a parent to a child, you just pass it in via its props. So if I have a look at my to-do list component, you can see that this is nice and simple. All it's doing is rather than taking the list of items directly from the state, that gets passed in as part of its props. And here we say that, okay, props.items comes from the state of the parent component. So, my state here is this list of 3 items, and then that gets passed down another level as these props. So this is basically similar to what you saw yesterday, where you've got, state and a high-level component being passed down to lower-level components with props. The bit that's new here and is like a little bit more tricky is the add form component, because now what we've also got is we've got this kind of interactivity happening over more than one level. So let me open up the add form component. And essentially, the way this works is that you sort of pass down extra callbacks. So we have this kind of extra level of indirection that, from this component, we can't directly set the state because obviously the state's not in this component, the state's in the parent component. And so what we want to do is we want to make it so, okay, when the form is submitted here, it updates the state here. And the way we do that is kind of a two-stage process. First of all, we pass a callback prop down from the parent to the child. So we pass a prop down from app to add form, which is basically a function. And then add form can call that function in order to make the function in the parent happen. So let's look at that. Let's look at the on item add version. So here you can see that we're passing down a prop, and this is a prop that we've basically made up the name of, just like any other prop. Except this time, rather than passing down, a string or an array or whatever, we're passing down a function. So within add form, props.onItemAdd is basically going to be this function here. If I have a look here, you can see that on item add, that prop is this function here, which I can go ahead and call. Then in my child component, when I submit my form, I then call that callback function. So I call props.onItemAdd, passing in the event from my from my DOM element, which the event that I'm handling. And so this will be calling this function, and that calls this function, which makes my item be added. So essentially, there's just this one extra level of indirection going on. That rather than doing things directly in this component or directly in the form in the onSubmit, instead the onSubmit calls a function which has come down through the props, and it's that which then does the update in the parent component. So adding the item, or in our other example, so for keeping this value in sync with what we've got typed here, then we say, okay, we'll pass down a prop, which is a function, and that function will be the thing which updates the state. And then in our child, when we change that input, then we're going to call the function that we've passed down so that update to the state actually takes place. So there's a bit to get your head around here. This is what you're going to be spending a lot of time today and tomorrow practicing, this idea that we pass down functions as props and then call them in order to make things happen across the different layers of components. Does that last bit make sense to everyone? Does anyone have any questions at this point? Give me a thumbs up if it makes sense. Shout me a question if you got one. Kind of fundamentally, there's just two key parts that you need to remember, and if you're doing both parts, then you'll be good. The two important bits are that you pass down a function as a prop from the parent to the child, and then you call that function in the child to make something happen in the parent. And if you can get like that kind of two-step process settled solidly in your brain, then that will be basically where you need to be. Which brings me on to what you're going to be working on. So today is basically a series of drills just looking at this process. So you're going to be making a series of kind of small interactive applications which work across multiple components. So you're going to be working to pass down information, pass down functions from a parent to a child, and then call those functions in order to make something happen. Yeah, and as I say, apologies that this has been a bit shorter than normal, but I think that should be enough to get you all up and running and at least starting to work on all of this. Does anyone have any questions about what they need to be working on today, or anything else which they want me to take a look at? All right.
Hi, Joe.
Yeah, hey, George.
Can you tell me the difference between a stateful, stateless? I was having a debate with a student, and I wasn't sure which one was which. If you could talk about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So if you run a dead simple rule for is my component stateful or is it stateless, then the really simple thing is just to look at how it's declared. So the simple rule is if it's a function, it's stateless, and if it's a class, it's stateful. So this is a stateful component, this is a stateless component. It gets a bit more subtle. So you can have stateful components which don't actually declare any state in them, which just have a kind of empty state. So if we didn't need this, then we could have this as a stateful component which didn't actually declare its state and just had empty state. But we would still talk about it as being a stateful component because it's a class. So that's your kind of simple rule. And it's only stateful components that can actually have state as part of them. And I probably should have mentioned this earlier, that refs also only work with stateful components. So that's another place that you'll need to make stateful components, even if it doesn't need a state. If you want to use a ref, then make it a class. Does that make sense, George?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Cool. Anyone else got anything for me at this point? All right, great.
All right.
In that case,
So in that case, Alex Kumbo has kindly stepped in to work with you guys this morning, along with Ray Smith, who will be your instructor on Friday. So they're both going to handle any questions that you guys have as you get started this morning. And then we won't have an afternoon workshop. You guys will right into working with the TAs in the afternoon.
great.
Yeah. Sorry, Joe, go for it.
And I was just going to say thank you all very much for bearing with me this morning. I know this hasn't been perfect, so yes, you guys are awesome. Thanks, everyone. Cool. I guess jump into your pairs, folks.